She was forced to marry a millionaire to save her family's reputation. But everything changed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. The gray sky loomed heavily over a small college town in Texas, the streets slick with rain and the air sharp with the scent of wet asphalt. Mark Davis trudged along the cracked sidewalk, his backpack hanging low from one shoulder. At only 23 years old, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him harder than the storm clouds above. He was in his final year of law school, juggling endless classes, a part-time job, and debts left behind by his late father. The bills piled up higher than his textbooks, and each step forward felt like walking through quicksand. As he walked past a row of shuttered shops, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Mark fumbled it out, rain dripping down the screen. He answered with a weary voice. Mark Davis speaking. On the other end came a smooth, commanding tone. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I would like to meet with you. It is regarding your financial situation." Mark froze under the drizzle. "I am sorry. Who are you? How do you even know about—" "I know enough," the voice interrupted, calm, precise, and undeniable. "Let us meet at Brooks Bistro, 7 o'clock this evening. It is important." The line went dead before Mark could argue. He stared at the phone in disbelief, water dripping from his hair onto the screen. Eleanor Brooks? He had heard the name before. A woman of immense wealth, a widow who had built an empire of real estate and influence. But why would she call him? By evening, Mark found himself pushing open the polished glass door of Brooks Bistro. Warm light spilled across the mahogany floors, the scent of roasted coffee beans mingling with the soft clink of cutlery. He felt completely out of place in his worn jacket, rain seeping into his shoes. At a corner table sat a woman in her 70s, her silver hair styled to perfection, a tailored navy suit hugging her frame. Her presence was magnetic. Eleanor Brooks did not look frail or fragile. She radiated authority. "Mark," she said smoothly, gesturing toward the chair opposite her. "Sit down." He hesitated, then obeyed. His voice trembled slightly. "Mrs. Brooks, what is this about?" Her piercing blue eyes met his. "I know about your debts, Mark, the ones your father left behind. I know you are barely scraping by, that your part-time job cannot even cover your mother's treatments. I am here to offer a solution." Mark's brows furrowed. "And what would that be?" Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate grace. Her next words landed like thunder. "Marry me." For a moment, the world stopped. The hum of the cafe faded, the rain on the windows fell silent. Mark blinked, convinced he had misheard. "Excuse me? What?" "You heard me," Eleanor said, her tone steady as stone. "This is not about romance. It is a business arrangement. I will pay off every cent of your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you will be my husband." Mark let out a short, nervous laugh, shaking his head. "You are serious? Why me? You do not even know me." "Exactly," Eleanor replied, leaning forward slightly. "You are young. You are unattached. You are desperate enough to consider this. I do not need love, Mark. I need companionship, someone to share my name, my estate, and nothing more. Think of it as a contract." Mark pushed back his chair, his pulse pounding. "This is insane. I need time to think." Her expression softened, only slightly. "Do not take too long. My offer will not stand forever." As Mark walked back out into the rain, his thoughts churned louder than the storm. Had he just been offered salvation? Or had he just been invited to sell his soul? Mark walked home in a haze, the steady drizzle soaking through his jacket. Every step echoed the same impossible question. Had Eleanor Brooks truly asked him to marry her? The rain felt colder than before, dripping down his collar and clinging to his skin. But the chill inside his chest was worse. By the time he reached the small apartment he shared with his mother and younger sister, his clothes were plastered to him, his hair dripping as he pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soup and medicine. His mother sat at the kitchen table, pale and fragile, her thin hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. His sister was bent over her textbooks, trying to focus under the flickering light bulb. Both of them looked up when Mark entered, and both of them saw the storm in his expression. "Mark," his mother said softly, "what happened? You look like you have seen a ghost." He dropped his backpack onto the floor and sank into the nearest chair. For a long moment he could not find the words. Finally he said, "A woman offered me a way out of our debts, a way to cover your treatment, Mom. But the price—" His voice trailed off. His mother frowned, concern shadowing her eyes. "What kind of price?" Mark looked down at his trembling hands. "Marriage. She asked me to marry her, Eleanor Brooks. She said it would not be about love, just a contract. In exchange, she would pay everything." The words hung heavy in the kitchen. His sister gasped, her pencil clattering against the table. His mother's lips parted, then pressed tightly together as if weighing something too difficult to say. At last she whispered, "I know it sounds unthinkable, Mark, but maybe it is worth considering. If she is willing to help, maybe this is the way." Mark's chest tightened. "You are asking me to marry a woman I do not love just to solve our problems?" "I am asking you to save yourself," his mother said, her voice trembling. "To save us." Silence stretched long, broken only by the sound of rain against the thin windowpane. Mark pressed his palms into his face, torn between his pride and his desperation. He wanted to scream that he would find another way, that he could fix this on his own, but the truth gnawed at him. Every job he worked barely scratched the surface of what they owed. His mother's treatments were draining what little remained. His sister's tuition loomed ahead like a wall he could never climb. That night, sleep never came. He stared at the cracked ceiling until dawn broke faintly gray through the curtains. By morning, his decision was still unresolved, but the seed of inevitability had been planted. Later that day, Mark found himself once again walking toward Brooks' Bistro. The rain had stopped, but the air carried the dampness of a storm that had not truly passed. Inside, Eleanor Brooks was already waiting at the same table. Her posture perfect, her tablet glowing faintly under the soft light. She did not look up immediately, but when she did, her gaze was sharp as glass. "You have decided?" she said, not as a question but as a statement. Mark swallowed hard, then nodded once. "I will do it." A faint smile touched her lips, though it never reached her eyes. She set her tablet aside with precision. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." A week later, Mark stood in a small courthouse, dressed in a suit that Eleanor had provided. The ceremony was brief, almost clinical, witnessed only by Eleanor's lawyer and a notary. The words of the officiant blurred in his ears, surreal and heavy, until at last he heard the pronouncement, "husband and wife." Eleanor turned to him, offering her hand. Her grip was firm, her smile practiced. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." As they stepped outside, the drizzle returned, fine drops speckling the courthouse steps. Mark glanced at his reflection in a puddle on the sidewalk, the suit sharp against his gaunt frame, the new ring gleaming on his hand. He could not tell if he had just saved his family or sold his soul. The ride to Eleanor's estate was silent. The cab wound its way up a long driveway lined with ancient oak trees, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling monument of stone and glass. Towering columns supported balconies lined with wrought iron, and the windows gleamed like dark, watchful eyes. It looked less like a home and more like a museum, a fortress of wealth and power. When the cab stopped, a pair of uniformed staff hurried to collect their luggage. Mark stepped out, suitcase in hand, feeling more like a visitor than a husband. Eleanor's heels clicked against the marble steps as she ascended with practiced elegance. She glanced back once, her expression unreadable. "Come inside," she said simply. The foyer was grand, filled with the scent of polished wood and fresh lilies. A chandelier of crystal hung overhead, scattering light across the marble floor. Everything gleamed with perfection, but to Mark it felt cold, untouched by human warmth. "This is your home now," Eleanor said, her voice calm, almost detached. "Dinner is at 7. I trust you will adjust quickly." Mark nodded mutely as a housekeeper led him upstairs. The room he was shown into was vast, with a king-sized bed, antique furnishings, and windows that looked out onto manicured gardens. It was the kind of room most men could only dream of. Yet, as he set his suitcase down, the silence pressed in. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the golden ring on his finger. His chest ached with uncertainty. He had given up something he could never take back. Whether it was his freedom or his soul, he did not yet know. The dining table stretched longer than any Mark had ever seen, polished wood gleaming under chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars. At one end, Eleanor Brooks sat composed in a silk blouse and pearls, cutting her filet mignon with surgical precision. At the other end, Mark sat stiffly, hands folded in his lap, the food in front of him untouched. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint clink of silver against china. "I trust you are settling in," Eleanor said finally, her voice smooth but distant. Mark cleared his throat. "The place is enormous. It feels like I might get lost." A faint smile curved her lips, though it did not soften her face. "You will adjust. Everything here runs according to order. The staff knows their roles, as you should learn yours." Mark shifted uneasily. "And what exactly is my role?" Her gaze lifted to meet his, sharp and unwavering. "To stand beside me when required. To represent stability. Appearances matter, Mr. Davis. Our marriage is a shield, not a romance." The words landed like stones in his stomach. He nodded faintly, pressing his fork into the untouched vegetables, but he could not bring himself to eat. When dinner ended, Eleanor dismissed him with a simple, "Good night." That night, Mark lay awake in the massive bed, staring at the ornate ceiling. The mansion was silent except for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere down the hall. He thought of his mother's fragile smile, his sister's hopeful eyes. He had done this for them, he reminded himself. And yet the thought did little to ease the emptiness pressing down on him. Days blurred into a new rhythm. In the mornings, Eleanor disappeared into meetings with lawyers and advisors. In the afternoons, Mark wandered the endless halls of the mansion, feeling like a ghost in a museum. Staff bowed politely but kept their distance, their eyes lowered, their voices hushed. One evening, a chauffeur arrived with instructions. Eleanor was attending a gala at the city's most prestigious hotel. Mark was expected to accompany her. When he stepped into the ballroom later that night, Mark felt every eye turn. The chandeliers glowed golden overhead, casting light across gowns and tuxedos, the air thick with perfume and whispered gossip. Eleanor's hand rested lightly on his arm, guiding him through the crowd with effortless grace. At first, Mark stood silent, a prop at her side. But then a journalist approached, microphone in hand, eyes glittering with suspicion. "Mr. Davis," the journalist said loudly, drawing attention from nearby guests. "You are quite the surprise. No one has ever heard of you. Tell us, how does a law student from a modest background suddenly become the husband of Eleanor Brooks?" The question was a knife. Mark's heart pounded, heat rising in his chest. For a moment, words failed him. Then he remembered his mother's voice. "I am asking you to save us." He straightened his posture, forcing calm into his tone. "I may not come from wealth," he said steadily, "but I come from a family that values loyalty and strength. Eleanor and I found something in each other that goes beyond money." The journalist blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Cameras flashed. Around them, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's eyes flicked sideways at him, her expression unreadable, but a faint glimmer of approval shone beneath her composed mask. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and polite smiles. Mark spoke little, but his few words carried weight. By the end of the night, he noticed fewer skeptical stares, more curious glances. Back in the car, Eleanor finally broke the silence. "You handled yourself well tonight." Mark exhaled slowly, relief mingling with exhaustion. "I only said the truth." Her lips curved slightly, the first trace of something human in her expression. "Truth," she echoed softly. "That will be tested again and again." The car rolled through the sleeping city, the glow of streetlights flickering across her face. For the first time, Mark wondered if behind the walls she built around herself, Eleanor Brooks carried secrets far heavier than his own. When they returned to the mansion, Mark paused in the foyer, staring at the marble floors and towering ceilings. The house no longer looked like a fortress of stone, but like a stage where every move was judged. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the shift. He was no longer just a desperate student who had signed away his freedom. He was part of something larger. something he could not yet name. Upstairs in his room, he removed the suit jacket, hanging it carefully on the chair. He sat at the desk, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him was still Mark Davis, but different. A husband in name only, bound by a contract. Yet tonight, for a fleeting moment, he had glimpsed the possibility of becoming more. He whispered into the empty room, "What have I gotten myself into?" The silence offered no answer, only the faint echo of his own voice, swallowed by the vastness of the mansion. The days that followed the gala carried a strange rhythm. Mark woke each morning to the quiet hum of staff moving through the mansion, their footsteps soft against marble floors. Eleanor was often gone before he even came downstairs, her days swallowed by board meetings and private appointments. When she did return, she carried herself with the same poise as always, polished and untouchable, her words measured and brief. Mark felt like a ghost, drifting through corridors gilded with wealth he did not belong to. The mansion had everything: libraries filled with rare books, gardens manicured to perfection, a dining hall fit for royalty, but none of it felt alive. One evening, Eleanor invited him into her private study. It was a room unlike the rest of the house, warmer, lined with shelves of well-worn novels and photographs in silver frames. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting light across her face. "Sit," she said simply, motioning to the chair across from her desk. Mark obeyed, uneasy. "Is something wrong?" Her eyes studied him carefully. "Not wrong. Necessary. You must understand, Mark. Our arrangement will continue to attract scrutiny. People will question us. They will search for cracks in the story. If you are to remain at my side, you must learn the rules." He leaned forward, restless. "And what are the rules?" She lifted a thin folder and placed it before him. Inside were schedules, event lists, and expectations, written out in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Appearances, to attend together. Causes, to support. Lines to memorize. "It is a contract within the contract," she said quietly. "Follow it, and we both get what we need. Stray from it, and everything collapses." Mark closed the folder slowly, the weight of it pressing down on him. "And if I fail?" Her expression softened for the briefest moment. "Then you will not only lose what I promised, but you will destroy yourself in the eyes of everyone who matters. I cannot protect you from that." The fire popped, scattering sparks into the air. Mark sat in silence, staring at the folder. It was more than rules, it was a cage. Yet behind Eleanor's steady voice, he sensed something deeper, a flicker of vulnerability she tried to hide. For the first time, he wondered if Eleanor's need for control came not only from power, but from fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being betrayed. Fear that no one could stand beside her without expecting something in return. Mark left the study that night with the folder tucked under his arm, his mind heavy with questions. The mansion's hallways stretched endlessly before him, quiet and cold, but inside him a storm had begun. He was bound by duty, by debt, by the ring on his finger. Yet a part of him whispered that perhaps this marriage, born from desperation, might carry secrets that could change everything. Mark did his best to follow the rules Eleanor had given him, memorizing the schedule, rehearsing the lines she expected him to say in public, and attending every event at her side. At first, he felt like an actor stumbling through a play written for someone else. But as the weeks passed, something unexpected began to shift. At a charity luncheon held in a glass-domed hall downtown, Mark watched Eleanor move through the crowd. Her smile was practiced, her handshake firm. But he began to notice the cracks in her armor. When no one was watching, her shoulders sagged ever so slightly. Her eyes, so sharp under the gaze of reporters, dimmed when she thought herself unseen. Later that evening, back at the mansion, they sat together at the long table, though closer this time than before. Eleanor sipped her wine in silence until she finally said, "You surprised me today." Mark set down his fork. "Surprised you how?" "You spoke to the director of the children's hospital," she said, her tone even but softer than usual. "Not with rehearsed words, with sincerity. They listened to you." Mark shrugged, uncertain how to respond. "I only told the truth. That donations mean more than numbers on paper. They mean lives changed." For the first time, Eleanor's expression faltered into something vulnerable. "Most people in my world do not speak that way anymore." The silence that followed was not cold, but almost fragile. Mark studied her across the candlelight, seeing her not as the untouchable figure who had cornered him into marriage, but as a woman who carried loneliness heavier than her wealth. Another night, after a gala that dragged late into the hours past midnight, Mark found Eleanor standing alone on the balcony, the city skyline glowing in the distance. She did not notice him at first. She leaned on the railing, her hands trembling faintly. "Are you all right?" Mark asked quietly, stepping closer. She turned, startled, then composed herself with a quick breath. "Yes, just tired." But Mark saw it, the crack in the glass, the human beneath the perfect facade. He hesitated, then offered his jacket, draping it gently over her shoulders. She did not protest. For the first time, she looked at him not as a contract, not as a shield, but as a man standing beside her in the quiet. That night, as he lay awake once more in the vast, silent bedroom, Mark realized the cage he had stepped into was shifting. What began as obligation now carried something far more dangerous and far more real. The weeks after that night on the balcony carried a different weight. The distance between them, once a wall of cold marble, began to thin. Mark still followed Eleanor to events, still recited the rules she had given him, but in the quiet moments, he began to see her differently. One late evening, after a long board meeting, Eleanor returned to the mansion later than usual. Mark was waiting in the library, a book open but unread in his lap. She stepped inside, looking more weary than composed, her posture slouched for the first time. "You are still awake," she said softly, surprise in her tone. "I could not sleep," Mark admitted. "I thought you might want company." Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, then crossed the room and sat opposite him. The fire crackled between them, shadows flickering across the shelves. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice quieter than he had ever heard from her, Eleanor said, "I spent my entire life building walls, Mark. Every decision, every investment, every carefully calculated move. People see the wealth and assume it keeps me safe. But it does not. It only makes me more alone." Mark leaned forward, his voice steady. "You are not alone now." Her eyes lifted to his, sharp but uncertain, as if she wanted to believe him, yet feared what it might mean. "Do you think I trapped you here?" she asked suddenly. Mark inhaled slowly. "At first, yes. I thought you only wanted a shield. And maybe that was true. But now, I think you wanted something more. Maybe you wanted someone who would not abandon you." The silence that followed was heavy with truth. Eleanor looked away, her hands tightening on the glass of wine she held. "When I was younger, I watched my family tear itself apart over money. Betrayal was all I knew. I promised myself I would never be at anyone's mercy again." Mark felt the words settle deep inside him. For the first time, he saw the woman not as a figure of power, but as someone shaped by scars she could not erase. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you do not have to carry all of that alone anymore." Her breath caught, her carefully built mask faltering. She set down the glass with trembling fingers, then whispered, "Do not make promises you cannot keep." Mark did not answer. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. For a moment she did not move. Then, slowly, she allowed her fingers to rest against his. The fire burned lower, the mansion silent around them, but something had shifted. For the first time since the contract began, their connection felt less like an arrangement and more like the fragile beginning of something real. The fragile closeness that had begun to grow between Mark and Eleanor did not go unnoticed. Whispers traveled quickly through high society. At luncheons, in hushed corners of boardrooms, people speculated that the young law student had captured more than just Eleanor's public image. Some were curious, some jealous, and some determined to use it against her. It happened at a gala one late evening in the city. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and champagne glasses, and the crowd pressed close with cameras flashing. Mark stood beside Eleanor, feeling the steady rhythm of her hand resting lightly on his arm. She was smiling for the cameras, every inch the polished figure the world expected. But then the air shifted. A voice cut through the music and chatter, louder than the rest. "Tell us the truth, Mrs. Brooks." A rival businessman, one who had long resented Eleanor's control over prime real estate holdings, raised his glass high. "Everyone knows this marriage is nothing but a charade, a contract. You bought yourself a husband." The room went still, Every eye turned. Photographers angled their cameras, hungry for scandal. Mark felt the heat rise to his face, his pulse hammering in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor's hand tightened on his arm, stopping him. Her smile never faltered. "People will always believe what they want," she said calmly. "But tonight is not about gossip. It is about charity. If you wish to contribute, the donation table is that way. If not, please step aside." The crowd tittered nervously. Some applauded her composure, but others whispered more loudly now, emboldened by the public accusation. Mark felt the sting of humiliation burn through him. Later, as the car carried them back to the mansion, the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Mark could not hold it in. "Why did you not let me defend us?" he asked. Eleanor turned her gaze to the window, the city lights flickering across her profile. "Because every word you spoke would only feed them. The more you deny, the more they will insist it is true." His jaw tightened. "So we just let them think I am some desperate man who sold himself? That you are some manipulator who bought me?" Her voice was sharper now. "That is exactly what they already think, Mark. Why should I waste energy proving otherwise?" The words cut deep, more than she realized. Mark turned away, staring at the dark blur of the passing streets. He had accepted this arrangement to save his family. But the humiliation, the constant suspicion, the whispered lies, those were not debts he had agreed to pay. That night, back in his room, he sat in the dark, staring at the golden band on his finger. The anger inside him burned hotter than the storm outside. He thought of his mother's frail smile, his sister's hopeful eyes. He had promised himself this sacrifice was for them. But was he slowly destroying himself in the process? Down the hall, Eleanor stood alone in her study, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. She stared at the newspaper headlines already spinning the night's confrontation into a scandal. Her mask slipped in the solitude. Fear coiled inside her, the fear of losing everything she had built, and perhaps losing the one person who had begun to see her as more than wealth and power. The marriage that had begun as a shield was now cracking under pressure from the outside world. And in the cracks, both Eleanor and Mark stood at the edge of something fragile, dangerous, and undeniable. The scandal from the gala did not fade. Instead, it spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed headlines suggesting Eleanor Brooks had staged a sham marriage to protect her empire. Talk shows speculated about Mark Davis, the unknown law student turned sudden husband, painting him as everything from a gold digger to a willing pawn. For the first time since the contract began, Mark realized that his silence was no longer enough to shield either of them. One morning, as he sat at the breakfast table, the staff whispering in the background, Eleanor entered the room with a newspaper in her hand. She tossed it onto the polished surface in front of him. The headline screamed, "The Contract Marriage of Eleanor Brooks." Below, a photo from the gala showed Mark standing beside her, his expression tense, while the rival businessman smirked in the background. "They will not stop," Eleanor said, her voice low and bitter. "The more I ignore them, the louder they become." Mark looked at the paper, then at her. "Then stop ignoring them. Stop pretending we are only a facade. If you want people to believe in us, you have to give them the truth." "Oh?" Her eyes narrowed. "And what truth would that be, Mark? That I trapped you into this marriage? That I dangled money over your head until you agreed?" He pushed back his chair, standing. "That might have been how it started. But it is not what it is anymore." For a moment, her composure faltered. She stared at him, the words hanging heavy in the air. He could see it in her eyes, the conflict she refused to name. Before she could answer, the butler entered the room, pale and nervous. "Mrs. Brooks, there is a visitor demanding to see you. He says it concerns your husband." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Send him in." The rival businessman stepped into the dining room, smugness written across his face. "I thought you should know," he said, holding up a file, "that I have evidence of your little arrangement. A marriage contract. Cold, legal, binding. How do you think the press will enjoy this?" Mark's blood ran cold. He turned to Eleanor, but she did not flinch. Instead, she rose slowly, her voice calm but cutting. "You think you have won because you found a piece of paper, but contracts can be broken. Loyalty cannot. the man sneered. "We will see how loyal he is when the world turns on him." After the intruder left, Mark turned to Eleanor. "Is it true? Did you keep the contract in a place where it could be found?" Her silence was answer enough. Frustration and hurt surged inside him. "You told me this was just business. But now the whole world knows, and I am the one who looks like a fool." Eleanor's voice cracked for the first time. "I never meant for it to become this. I thought I could control it. I thought I could control everything." Mark's anger dimmed at the sight of her vulnerability, but the damage was already done. Their fragile connection, the quiet moments they had begun to share, now trembled on the edge of collapse. That night, as Eleanor locked herself in her study, and Mark paced the endless halls of the mansion, both of them faced the same question. Would this marriage, once a cage, then a fragile hope, survive the weight of truth, or shatter completely under the world's gaze? The following days were filled with silence, the kind that lingered heavy in the halls of the mansion. Mark barely saw Eleanor except at public appearances where they both wore masks of composure. The whispers outside grew louder, reporters camping at the gates, articles speculating on when the marriage would collapse. Inside, the distance between them was more suffocating than the flash of any camera. One evening, Mark found himself standing in front of Eleanor's study door. For hours he had wrestled with his pride, with the sting of humiliation, with the memory of every sacrifice he had made for his family. At last, he pushed the door open. Eleanor was at her desk, her head bowed over a pile of papers, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world pressed down upon her. "We cannot go on like this," Mark said quietly. Her eyes lifted, tired and guarded. "Do you regret it? Do you regret marrying me?" Mark stepped closer, his voice steady. "At first, yes, I thought I had sold my soul. But then, I saw you. Not just the Eleanor Brooks the world fears or envies, but the woman who has lived alone for too long. The woman who still carries scars from betrayals she never deserved. I will not let them define you. And I will not let them define us." For the first time in weeks, her composure cracked. She blinked back tears, her lips trembling. "But the contract, Mark, it is out there now. They will never believe this is real." "Oh or no?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the very contract that had nearly destroyed them. With a calm resolve, he tore the pages in half, letting the fragments scatter across her desk like falling snow. "Then let us show them, not with papers, not with signatures, with truth." The following week, Eleanor and Mark walked into a crowded ballroom, reporters buzzing like flies, cameras flashing with relentless hunger. Instead of avoiding the questions, Mark took Eleanor's hand and stepped forward. "Yes," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "It began as a contract, but somewhere along the way, it became something else. I fell in love with the woman who stands beside me now. She is not just Eleanor Brooks, the millionaire. She is Eleanor, the woman who taught me strength, who showed me what loyalty means. Believe what you want, but that is the truth." A hush fell. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the applause began. It spread through the crowd, hesitant at first, then louder, until even those who doubted found themselves clapping. Cameras flashed, but this time it was not scandal they captured. It was devotion. That night, back at the mansion, Eleanor stood with Mark on the balcony. The city stretched before them, lights shimmering like fallen stars. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "You gave me something I never thought I would have again, a reason to believe." Mark smiled faintly, lifting her hand to his lips. "And you gave me something I never thought I could find in this house of marble and silence. A home." When he kissed her, it was not part of a contract, not part of a performance. It was real. The kind of truth no scandal, no rumor, no headline could ever erase. Their story had begun as a bargain written on paper. It ended with a promise written in their hearts. A promise not of wealth or appearances, but of love that was finally, undeniably true.